Welcome to Moving Conversations, a podcast for movement professionals by movement professionals. If you coach, train, or teach movement, Pilates, or fitness, then this podcast is for you. With more than 60 years of experience in fitness and Pilates, your hosts, Brian Ritchie and Nora St. John, explore the science of human movement, diving deep into the facts, myths, and common misconceptions, hoping to spark thought and conversation about how we view fitness and movement. Now, let's jump into Moving Conversations. And welcome to another episode of Moving Conversations. I'm Brian Ritchie. Joining me as always is Nora St. John. Good morning, Nora. How's things?
Very well, Brian. How are you?
Doing good.
Yeah.
Good. This, as we were talking about just before we hit the record button, this week feels like it's been very long and it's only 3 days in.
So I felt yesterday.
Oh, man. Yesterday I was thinking all day long it was Thursday. I was like, oh, it's almost over. And then I was reminded, no, it's Tuesday. I was, son of a gun. All right, ramp up. Here we go.
Keep going. Keep moving.
Exactly. Momentum. I joke to everybody. It's like, it's like I'm a shark. Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming. Just keep going forward all the time. Never stop. It's okay.
Absolutely.
Well, today we're going to do another deep dive. We've covered a lot of topics in the podcast, and, we try and limit these to about an hour, no longer. That way, on your commute or whatnot, you can easily download and have a little bit of an enjoyment to and from work or something. So we try and limit it. The problem is we have so much more to say. I mean, with every topic we choose, we could probably go for another hour, if not longer. Especially now that we have the video option too, so we can use props and things. So we got a few props with us today. So anybody who hasn't seen us on YouTube, check it out on the YouTube channel. The link is in the bio, and it's under mine. So if you look at Brian Ritchie, it's under all of my files right now. And yeah, it's doing pretty well. We're getting some people to watch, which is always nice. You can always reach us. Let me throw out our socials right now. Reach us. Everything is at Moving Convos. So movingconvos@gmail.com. Instagram is Moving Convos, and Moving Conversations on Facebook, as well as our personal socials. And all of that is in the course or in the podcast description.
Awesome.
So today's deep dive is going to be on the shoulder.
The shoulder. And what do we say about the shoulder? We always say about the shoulder, because I was just doing some video editing Brian and I have just done some video work together. Also, the shoulder, we say quite facetiously, is a very straightforward part of the body where everything makes perfect sense.
Oh, 100%.
And it's very simple to understand. And how everything works together is very straightforward.
Yeah.
That is complete facetiousness on every front, just in case you were wondering.
Yeah, this is one of those that when you take a look at it, you think, oh, it kind of makes sense because it's upper body. And, coming from more of the fitness world, people divide, upper body to lower body and things. And upper body, it's like, oh, the upper body is usually the easier of the two just because people gravitate toward it. But man, is it complex. There is so much going on.
There's so much going on. So you mentioned earlier, before we started this conversation, that there's 17 muscles that attach to the scapula.
Just to the scapula alone, 17 muscles that control that.
And that doesn't include the humerus or the clavicle or the rib cage or the spine or all the other pieces that are attached to that. And that complexity is interesting and challenging.
Well,
I know.
If we just think about the joint in and of itself, it's a free-floating joint on the thorax. So
the scapula floats like it's got no direct bony connection.
Right, no bone or pure ligament connection to the thorax. It's held on by just muscle. So
purely.
It really is just floating there. And if you get any imbalances within the musculature, well, that scapula can go anywhere it chooses to go.
Or anywhere those muscles tell it to go.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Because they're in charge. They're in charge of the situation. One image that I use here, that we'll see if this works for anybody. One image I use is, I really do think of the scapula, just like Brian was saying, as kind of a floating island. right? That can go up, right? It can elevate, it can go up towards your ears, it can go down towards your waist, it can round around your rib cage into protraction, or it can come towards your spine in retraction, right? And it can even rotate, right? Into upward or downward rotation. So that scapula can really has a lot of three-dimensional movement,
Mm-hmm.
multiplanar movement around the rib cage.
Mm-hmm.
And I often think about, like, I call it sort of the dance of the shoulder muscles, because it takes all of those muscles working in harmony to do any one of those movements.
Yeah.
And one other thing that always struck me the first time I learned anatomy, because when you first learn anatomy, it's like, okay, well, you have, for example, the trapezius. It's a scapular elevator. It's a scapular depressor. Okay, how does one muscle do two things?
Right.
Right? So then
Opposite things.
It's two opposite things, right? Not just two things, but two things that, like, one goes this way, one goes this way. How does it do both? And so looking deeper and deeper into anatomy, understanding it's not just which fibers of that individual muscle are being used, but how it is partnering with other partners in the scapula square dance, if you will.
Yep. Yep.
Right.
It's interesting just thinking about the scapula in and of itself. Like you said, when we first learn about this, we learn that here's the shoulder blade, here's the scapula, and here's where it sits.
Yep.
And normally a lot of people, we learn the bones, we learn the names of the bones. This is in school. And then you learn the muscles and you learn the name of the muscles. And then you learn where they attach. And then you'll learn about the actions. And when you're looking at that, a lot of times people don't put 2 and 2 together, or, what is it? 7 or 8 and 9 together and get 17, because the scapula in and of itself has so many attachment points and so many different muscles attached to it that it's being pulled constantly in all different directions. I remember you and I sat, I believe it was in Anaheim,
Yes.
and we were sitting outside enjoying the sun one day, and we were talking about how could we, on a full-size skeleton, create through either springs or through bands or whatnot, all the different attachments for the scapula that could fixate it where it should be in space, and not fixate it, but have it be attached to the thorax where it should be in space, with all the muscles pulling in all those different directions, so that when we go to make some movement, we can feel what stretches, what pulls, what contracts, what elongates. And the complexity to that, I mean, both of our minds were just blown at trying to figure out, wait, this comes from here, this comes from here, this comes from here. Wait, how are we going to pull this one? How are we going to do that? The complexity of the shoulder is just mind-blowing. And it's within that complexity that really allows us to do the great ranges of motion that our shoulder allows us to do.
Absolutely. Without that, we got nothing. All right. I mean, there's so many things as humans, and I'm going to really emphasize that as humans that require that range of motion and that amount of mobility and sophistication of the scapula.
Mm-hmm.
You compare it to an all fours creature like a dog or cat, right? And their scapula don't, they got to go kind of like this along their spine. They got to go glide forward and back. When they take that arm forward, they take that other arm back. And if you ever watch a cat or you play with a cat's loose fur, right? You can feel the scapula kind of come together, they come apart. But mostly they're doing just a fairly simple motion. Mm-hmm. Humans, like, first of all, we have our hands, which create extremely complex connections all the way up through our forearms, into our upper arms, into our shoulders, and doing all kinds of different things, right? Mm-hmm. Behind us, in front of us, above us, all the things we do with our hands create that. And then all the different motions that we do just in daily life. I mean, really, putting on your shoes, putting on a sweater. Mm-hmm. Right? Think about putting on a coat or a sweater, putting on coming and grabbing your seatbelt and pulling that across your body. Right. There's so much of that happens just in ordinary daily life for us as humans.
I always like to go back evolutionarily, or just in time, thinking about humans, comparing to the primates, where we're doing a lot more climbing, a lot more living in the trees, swinging, hanging, a lot more of that. And then, now that we're ground bound for the most part, what did our ancestors do? Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of, weaponry, throwing, we have to hunt. So we use spears. There's a lot of throwing. There's a lot of hunting, gathering, all of that, that our shoulders are doing so much as a bipedal, animal, that we really rely on that. And
Yeah.
we really rely on what we can do and what we ask it to do. And then, like you said, what do we do on a regular basis that involves all those ranges of motion? And we're not talking about sports here. We're talking about like putting on
Yeah,
your
it's daily
seatbelt.
life. Exactly. Just
Just
ordinary everyday things.
one of the things that I always, challenge people to do sometimes is, how do you dry your back with a towel?
Right,
The
right,
amount
right.
of range of motion to take that behind and then to go
Yep,
to the other side and go backwards, because
yep.
everybody does it one way really well, and then they're kind of, "Oh, how do I do this?" And they end up choking themselves across their body trying to get it the other direction.
Right.
But that's internal, external rotation, elevation, depression, retraction, protraction. So much in a simple activity that we all have to do when we shower.
So let's take that as a test for everybody out there. If you want to play with us for this, one of the simple ways to just feel these differences on the two sides, I'm thinking
Mhm.
about the drawing towel thing, is a pretty typical exercise to look at shoulder range of motion in kind of a complex way. So this is where you're basically trying to grab your hands behind your back. So one hand's going up and like it's trying to touch the top of your back. The other one is coming from below, right, and trying to touch the middle of your back, and you're trying to see if you can touch your fingers to each other, right? And I'm not doing so well on that one shoulder, right? And so you feel
Notice
how
I'm
that
not
is on the
showing the
one
other
side,
side.
right? Exactly, right. So we're and again, you can see this on YouTube, but you can also try to describe it for you as well. And you try the other side, and it's like in my case, it is completely different. One side, yeah. Brian's fingers first, they were touching on his other side, and now he's got about a hand width between the two.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And that's really normal that people are that different on the two sides because we have handedness, right? We're right-handed or we're dominant on one side of our body or we've done a sport that's one-sided or whatever.
Yep, yep. That I mean, it's called a scratch test,
There we
in
go.
medical
Nice. Like you're
terms.
trying to scratch
Yeah,
your middle vertebra. Yeah.
and it's something that is very challenging for a lot of people. They do one side really, really well, and they're like, "Oh, I got this," and they go to the other side, and I've had some people who can't even take their hand, and for a woman's body, can't even put it to where they would have to attach their bra strap, you
Right.
know?
Right. Yep.
And that's usually the biggest concern I get from women is they say, "I used to be able to attach it back there. Now I have to do it in the front and do the wiggle around."
Yep.
And it's like, "Oh, so we are limiting that range of motion. Something's too tight,
Yes.
and other things
Yes.
aren't strong enough." So there's that
Yes.
imbalance. But this is
Yep.
a great test that you can do on your clients that's really quick and easy, and, quick and dirty test that you can just say, "Oh, okay." And some people will get very anal about it and measure it, take out their tape measure and measure all that, and that's fine. But for me, it's kind of like, look, is it tight? Yes. What's tight? What's loose? And I'm going to just make a rough estimate sometimes and just say, oh, we're about 3 inches apart. Great. Because it doesn't have to be exact. We're hoping someday that we can narrow that gap down a little bit more.
Exactly. So when you're doing that, right, that points out many things. So we'll use that as an example because we wandered down that path. It points out first the asymmetries on the two sides,
Yep.
right? That very few people are perfectly symmetrical on the two sides. So we talked about this a lot. We talked about the core, for example, just how myofascial imbalances around the spine will create different stresses going through the spine. Well, the scapula and the whole shoulder, really the whole shoulder girdle, I'm going to expand that to the whole shoulder girdle, is even more complex that way and typically more asymmetrical.
Yep.
Right? That you've got like massive internal rotation on one side, so you can bring that hand that's behind your back really far up on one side. The other side is like, right, doesn't go at all because that internal rotation is more limited on that one side, and other things as well. So it's just one of those moments of really noting the asymmetry and how differently we use the two sides of our body.
Yeah. And just taking a look at, as a quick assessment sometimes, is just look at them from behind.
Mm-hmm.
What is their scapula doing? A quick and easy assessment. What is their scapula doing? Are they roughly even? Are they even to where the spinous process is? Or is one a little more rotated out? Is one higher than the other? Is one more
Yep.
rotated? Just noting all of these can give you a good an estimate or, an understanding of, oh, okay, there really are lopsided or one side dominant. We see this with a lot of throwing athletes or even tennis
Mhm.
players or things like that, that one side, their dominant side, is going to be a little bit more rounded forward, is going to be a little bit tighter. And you can see that from behind. So just having
Right.
that visual assessment can also help.
Exactly. Where are the scapula sitting? Are
Yeah.
they the same distance from the spine? Are they the same height? Right? All those things. Is the tip of the scapula. Now, this would require either using your hands, because you can't always see that through a shirt, right? Using your hands to feel where that bottom tip of the scapula is. Or if they've got a tank top on, you can usually see the shoulders pretty well. So that involves getting in there, right? And understanding
Mhm.
that. And if I'm going to work with the shoulder, I want to know all those things. Like, I want to know how that scapula is moving. I want to know, is it moving evenly in all directions? Protraction, retraction, elevation, depression, upward rotation, downward rotation. I want to know how it's integrated with the glenohumeral joint.
Mhm.
So, one of the things we talk about a lot there is scapulohumeral rhythm.
I just wrote that
Right, we've
down.
been
Yep.
right, we mentioned that before. So guys, again, if you want to join us with this is what happens when you take your arm basically either out to the side or to the front beyond about 80 degrees. So really, above shoulder height, right? As soon as you go close to shoulder height, you have to let that scapula upwardly rotate. See, Brian's showing it on the YouTube. So what has to happen is that scapula has to upwardly rotate, because otherwise that humeral head bumps into the acromion and causes a lot of the problems we talked about in our previous shoulder episode, impingement, basically. So take a moment there, even just, and I do this with clients all the time, just move your scapula, like
Yeah.
lift them up, push them down, open them up. So you're opening up the spine, squeeze the spine with your scapula. Just get used to the fact that the scapula move. Because for a lot of clients, they don't move very well, or they
Yeah.
only move on one side, or they're really stiff in one direction. And all of that will lead to tension patterns really through the whole body, but particularly through the whole upper body.
Something that I remind some of my younger students and trainers, when if you're not sure of what you're looking at, because obviously we have skin, we have muscle, we have shirt,
Yeah.
we have,
Yeah.
and in our facility, it's relatively chilly and it's cold outside. So someone may have a jacket on and you try to get them to take off as much as they feel comfortable with during an assessment. But I say, what stands out?
Right. What's obvious?
What's obvious? What's the
Mhm.
biggest thing that as I'm elevating both arms, am I shrugging one of my shoulders? Or am I depressing it as I'm bringing it up? Or am I rounding it forward? Those are the things that you can usually see a mile away. It's sort of like my initial assessment is what I notice from across the street. What's the big stuff? Because that will give me an indication, oh, something's going on here. Something might be a little glitchy in, what I'm seeing. So I often will take a look at that first and just say, okay, what's the big stuff? So if you're not comfortable with the minute, fine detail, look for that first, because you can always go beyond that, but that's the first step.
It's also often the biggest clue.
Yeah.
Right. I find sometimes with Pilates teachers, they'll go for this very detailed stuff, but they'll kind of miss the forest for the trees, or they
Mm,
miss the trees for they miss the forest for the trees. They get so into the details of like what the right ankle is doing that they miss the fact that that right hip is like hiked like crazy and the ribs are shifted to the left.
yep.
I'm over exaggerating a little bit, but there's also that idea that what is happening in a big picture? What is the big picture?
Yep.
What's the global picture? And then from there, again, if something sticks out, that's what you notice first. Their
Yeah.
leg is externally rotated. They hang their hip out to one side. Their ribs go to one side. One shoulder's higher, whatever it is. But really look for the big things first, because that's often your biggest clues.
Yeah. That's going to give you that first indication in my mind,
Yeah.
and a lot of times for me, that's my first, okay, I can see it from behind. You can see, oh, one's really elevated. Okay. That immediately tells me that if one's elevated, that means certain muscles are tight. Other muscles are probably overstretched. Okay, so then I'll take them into, let's lift your arms out to the side. Let's lift them forward. Does it look smooth? Does it look, is there a hitch in their giddy up? You know, is something not moving quite right? And you're like, oh, something's not right there.
And one thing that I want to do here, because you're starting to talk about this might be tight, this might be loose, is a key thing that I do when I'm doing anything with the shoulders is I want to focus on my mind and my eye on the movement of the bones and the range of motion of the joints. Because if that isn't working, the muscles are not doing the right thing.
Right.
Right. Like, in other words, it's one of those situations where I don't spend as much time like I will in the lower body, for example. I'll often go like, oh, I got to work on the adductors. I got to work on the abductors. In the shoulder, it's more like I need to get that right scapula to be able to protract. Right. And whatever it takes to do that, because there's a lot of muscles involved in most actions of the shoulder girdle. So again, rather than getting so much muscle specific, I really try to focus on movement specificity and trying to improve the movement pattern. And that'll give me a clue. Okay, so they're tight. Let's say they can't protract. They can't round their shoulders over their rib cage. Well, probably they're tight in the muscles between their shoulder blade and their spine, right? That's not allowing them to move the scapula forward. So then I know what I've got to loosen up. Yeah. Right. And again, I may name those muscles. It may be the trap. It may be the levator, maybe the rhomboids, maybe other things. But I'm not necessarily so much going to think about the name of the muscle as I am. Right. This is the movement I'm trying to correct.
And a lot of times that's what we're trying to do in general with what we do anyway. We're looking at movement. Yeah. And it doesn't matter if it's the trapezius that's causing the tightness, or if it's a levator scapula, or if it's the rhomboid. It doesn't matter. Something's tight in there. For me, when I see someone with an elevated scapula, I am going to watch their bones move. And it just gives me an indication, okay, I'm seeing something here in this area. And that will give me an idea of, okay, what do I want to accomplish? How do I want to see this movement smooth out? Or how do I get this shoulder blade to drop or elevate or do whatever it's not doing properly? So absolutely focus on the movement and motion, and what do you want to occur? Because right there, if you know what you want to occur, you already have an idea of what needs to happen, what muscles you need to work.
And how you're going to cue them and coach them. Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
So one of the examples I like to use here is talking about the trapezius. Right. So the trapezius as a muscle goes from the base of your skull. I'm using my hands for those of you who are only auditory, but I'm going to describe this too. It goes the base of your skull, attaches to along your spine, all the way down to T12. Okay,
that's
so it's
huge.
going to like go. That's huge, right? This is from your skull to like the bottom of your rib cage, right? That's one whole big giant long attachment. And so then the fibers go up and they attach on the other end to the lateral third or 2/3, third-ish, somewhere in there of your clavicle on the top, inside the acromion, and then along your scapular spine in the back. So, right, so it's attaching to your spine. It's attaching to kind of the top of the shoulder girdle, that clavicle across the acromion, across the scapular spine. So just, contemplate that for a moment. I contemplate that for a moment. And one of the things I like to do is like, if I take my fingers and I feel just the top of my clavicle, and you can do this with me, I go right, so on the top of my clavicle, it goes out to my acromion, it goes along the top of my scapular spine. Well, that's just interesting because now I got this muscle that's going up and down my spine and then kind of wrapping around kind of like a hood onto the top of my shoulder girdle, my clavicle and my scapula. Right. So, and again, if you got a good image somewhere in one of your anatomy books, take a look at it because it is a little weird. And one of the things about that is then you have fibers going in different angles. You have fibers that go from the clavicle. I think about them going from the top of the clavicle up towards the skull and the neck. I've got fibers that go from like the acromion and the top of that around to the middle of the upper thoracic, right? To the top of your thoracic spine. And then I have fibers that go from the top of the scapular spine and then dive down to T12. So I've got fibers going from the bottom, from the middle, and then from the top. Right. So just again, think about that. And so what does that do? That allows that musculature to orient and to organize where that scapula is sitting on the back of your rib cage. It can pull it up. It can pull it together, right? Bring it together into retraction. It can bring it down towards the base, towards your pelvis. And it can even, if they all work together, upwardly rotate and bring that whole bottom tip of the scapula out. So that's where that complex dance, that crazy dance, really, that crazy changing partners, if you will, can happen for any one muscle in the shoulder girdle.
And a lot of people sort of want to divide the trapezius into parts. Trap one being the portion that's
upper,
closest to our upper, that's cervical.
Yep.
Trap two is sort of just below that. Trap three is more mid back, and trap four is the one that sort of dips way down into, attaches to, like you said, the lower part of our rib cage down to T12 and such. Yep. So when we divide like that, a lot of people do sort of separate that, but it is one muscle group.
It's one muscle group. And one of the things that I know from anatomy as I learned it was in most anatomy books will say, well, the upper trapezius does this, and the middle trapezius does this, and the lower trapezius does this. But they never really said, well, what does the whole thing do when all of it contracts?
Right.
Right. Because muscles, they work, different fibers can certainly work in different ways, and different parts of a muscle can be activated, but it's one muscle. Right. So then what happens when all of those fibers are working together? And it's just one of those things I keep looking at every time I look at the anatomy of the upper body, is like, okay, well, there's all those little bits and pieces, but then where does that muscle work when it's working more globally, when the whole thing is going together? What happens there?
It's almost like a marionette. When you pull on just one string, the scapula will do elevation or retraction. When you pull on two, it'll begin to do a little bit of, protraction or elevation with retraction. And if you're pulling on all of them, then it does that upward rotation where, the entire thing gets contracts, and you get the uppermost portion actually rotating down towards T12 as the upper portion pulls the outer edges toward the neck.
Exactly.
So, literally, it's like a marionette pulling on different strings and allowing it to move properly. And like you said, it is a dance. If you ever watched a puppet master, work one of those marionettes, it looks human. It's like, oh my gosh, they can really make this thing move and dance. Yeah. And it's the same thing. It's a muscle dance. It's nerve innervation. You're telling the muscle what to do, how to do it. And it has to work properly in the proper sequence in order to do the smooth, consistent motion that we want it to achieve.
And at the proper amount, right? Because there's right. The miracle of our body. Really the miracle of our body. And I think about this a lot with the shoulder is, thank God, so much of it is happening without us having to really figure it out. Right. Right. And I always think of I think of a very, very deep pond, and then like a little tiny duck sitting on top of it. And that's our consciousness. And the rest is all happening without us having to do anything. Thank you very much for nervous system. Because like you think about how many motor units they're trying to fire to get that arm to reach up overhead.
Yeah.
Right. Which part of that muscle is going? Which part of other muscles are lengthening? Which part of other muscles? It's just complicated in there. A lot of things are happening.
And just in general, we have all of those muscles attaching to the scapula that's affecting, and anything that affects the scapula then is going to affect the clavicle. It's going to affect the humor. It's going to affect the entire shoulder complex.
Yep. So, and the spine.
And the
potentially the spine. Just to throw that in there.
Absolutely. So when you ask someone to do an overhead movement and they sort of get stuck and everything's not working properly, which I see a lot in my practice, one side they lift their hand and it's nice and smooth. The other side they elevate or they move it up, and you can see there's a little discomfort or a little pinch here or there. And you can see that things aren't moving nearly as smoothly. And it's really that muscle dance, not just in the trapezius. Again, we talked about, one muscle. Now there's all of these that have to work in conjunction with each other in order for everything to work smoothly. And like you said, if we had to do this, it's kind of like walking, to tell every single muscle what to do with every step you take. There's no way you'd move. You couldn't do it.
Take you 20 minutes to get to the bathroom.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
That's not going to
And it's
work.
the same thing with the shoulder is we want to make it as smooth as possible. And we want to have all of these muscles working in conjunction, in coordination, in symphonic harmony, kind of like
Yeah.
getting a band to work together. If
Yep.
one's out of tune, well, guess what? It's going to sound off. And
Yep.
if one muscle
Absolutely.
in that shoulder is out of tune and not working properly, you're going to see it. And
Yeah.
and often you're going to feel it.
So I want to, if you're okay, I want to take this in just
Mhm.
in this slightly different direction, maybe, which is one of the things like we're talking about creating smooth motion and looking for smooth motion. Sometimes you have to do some work to get that motion to be smooth,
Mhm.
right? So sometimes, like I'm thinking about ways that we identify areas that are tight, areas that are stiff. Because one of the things that I found in my practice is I'm often surprised by what is stiff. Like I think I know what the problem is. And then I start to explore, like with my hands or whatever. And I realize the problem is coming from somewhere completely different than I thought.
True.
Right. So I'm going to use an example. This is just an example. I was having some shoulder trouble on my left side. And I started to just like, I kept thinking, oh, it's like my serratus isn't working. My lat's really tight. I worked on those. Didn't really make a difference. Then I kind of went up and grabbed my tricep one day, just was squeezing my tricep and was like, oh, it's my tricep that was really, really tight. Like, and so all the tricep does, remember, is attached. It only has one of the head of the triceps that has a tiny attachment onto that upper lateral border of the scapula. But that one tension band in that area was leading all of the mechanics of the shoulder to not work properly.
Mhm.
Right. So sometimes it's the lat. Sometimes it's not always the triceps. It could be the biceps. It could be the pec. It could be the pec minor. Those are all places that I'm often going to go to see where is the sticky spot? What is not allowing this movement to happen appropriately?
Yeah. Have you now, you and I both have done body work
Yep.
extensively.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so, we're comfortable with feeling ourselves and being able to say, "Oh, okay, yeah, that's really tight."
Yeah.
When working with a client, oftentimes I will ask them, you know, to start feeling around and say, what if something feels amiss, if something feels,
Uh-huh. Yep.
specifically like you did, like, oh, wow, that's what I'm feeling. It's not up
Yeah.
here, it's
Yep.
over here. So will you ask a client to do that to themselves and say, oh, I just want you to, especially for the pec minor, that's often a very tight muscle, and we can release that with a ball or something like that. But you can actually just have them walk their fingers along, their upper ribs up towards
Nice.
their clavicle, up
Yeah.
towards
Yep. Yep.
the,
Yep. The
the
corporate
AC joint
process.
and be like,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, that's tight. I can really feel
Right.
that.
Yep. Yep.
And that could give us an indication, okay, that may be one of the troublesome spots,
Yep.
you know?
Yeah. So exactly. So how do you get a client to give you that information? Because again, with the shoulder, I really find it is not like where the pain and discomfort show up are not always related to what the issue is.
There's a lot of referred
There's
areas.
so much referred areas in there.
Yep.
Right. So exactly. So having them palpate, and even I'll just say, hey, grab your bicep for me. Let me know if that feels kind of funky. It's like, oh no, it feels fine. And then grab the right one and grab the left one. So
Uh-huh.
oftentimes, if they can't tell the difference, I'll say, well, feel the right one. Oh yeah, that feels kind of funky. What does the left one feel like? It feels the same. Okay, well that's good. Like they're both tight. That's fine. Maybe. So using self palpation, just having them do that. The other
Yep.
thing too is things like. A classic is a tight pec major and or pec minor, and just doing like a chest stretch, right? Let's say a door frame stretch, or even just lying supine, opening the arms out to the side or being on a foam roller. And a lot of times that's really simple. They'll go like, oh yeah, my right arm goes all the way to the ground. I don't feel it all. My left
Yep.
arm doesn't touch the ground and it hurts just to
Yep.
even be 2 inches off the ground, right? So I noticed that pec is something that I find is fairly easy to assess.
Yep.
One thing that is not, I find so easy to assess is the lat, the latissimus dorsi.
Mm.
And tension there really whacks. Well, it also affects the low back a lot because of its connection to the thoracolumbar fascia. So the lat, I find a couple things, and this one again, you can follow along. If somebody keeps their ribs in place and lifts their arm up overhead, If somebody has a really tight lat, their arm won't go very far.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, that they can't, for example, bring their upper arm to their ear. They'll often kind of like stop halfway, or they'll start to shift their ribs
Right.
towards that, towards that side to get that range of motion higher.
Yep.
Because they're literally so locked down. Remember, the latissimus dorsi goes from thoracolumbar fascia in the back, ties into the sacrum and the spine up to all the way down up to T7, and then comes out and attaches to the humerus.
Yep.
Right. So if they don't have that separation between the humerus and the spine, or in the thorax, that creates a huge amount of tension in the whole shoulder girdle.
Yeah, I've often put people even on their side, lying down, because a
Yeah.
lot of times we're on the mat
Yes.
table. So lying down, and just tell them, take your arm overhead. Just a pinwheel would be great, but not everybody can do that. But just take that
just
overhead.
Lift your arm up overhead.
And you'll see their rib cage begins to lift up. They begin to shrug their shoulder, and their whole body begins to sort of elevate, and their ribs leave the ground,
On the bottom side.
On the bottom side.
Yep, exactly.
They begin to arch, and you're like, oh, okay, there's some tension there as well. I also find some palpation, if they want to do this for release work, is on a foam roller. If you just have them lie on the side with the foam roller on their lat with their arm extended, so they're lying on their side, foam roller, just below the shoulder blade, the scapula on the ribs, and have them, that can be very, very tender. And that can often tell me, okay, they're really tight in that area as well. And sometimes they can't even take their arm and extend it. It's so tight. So then that'll tell me, okay, we really need to watch, we need to work on that.
Yep, exactly. Because what happens with that, I think about when the lat's really tight, I think about my swimmers. Right? It'll often pull them into a little kyphosis, round their scapula forward, kind of bringing that humerus towards their sacrum, essentially, if you want to think about it that way. So they tend to be a little more rounded, internally rotated in their humerus, potentially. And oftentimes, again, kyphotic in their upper back, sometimes really lordotic in their lower back, because of the way that compression comes into the lumbar.
Something that you can also see is guarding. There's a lot of guarding that'll occur when something is tight, or there's a range of motion that they don't feel comfortable with. I'm thinking of a client right now that every time I stretch him, he take one arm, we take overhead, and immediately everything tightens up, and he's preparing himself for pain.
Yeah, exactly. He's bracing.
And he'll say, he'll wait, slow down. And I'm like, I haven't even touched you. Relax.
Yeah.
And once he relaxes, I say, is there any pain? No, but he's preparing for the discomfort because low PTSD or whatever from the past. But if he helps and tries to lift it for me, that's when there will be often some discomfort. I find there's also an apprehension sign when I have someone who is, tight pec, or especially tight internal rotator, where you take that arm into external rotation, almost like a doorway stretch. And you take that 90-90 goalpost arms. And as soon as they take that hand back, you can see their arm doesn't want to. They start holding it back. They won't allow it to go all the way back. Those muscles are so tight. That there's that guarding.
And they'll either round forward.
Yes.
Right. Or they won't let the arm come up very high. So they'll keep the elbow low, and they'll kind of round that shoulder forward. One of those things I always think of that as limiting the openness in the front of the chest, in the front of the shoulder joint specifically. So if there's tightness in the biceps tendon, if there's a bursitis going on in there, any of those things will often make, again, that's where the shoulder is vulnerable, is when it's really open like that, because all those tissues are stretching, putting pressure on either the biceps tendon or the bursas that are in there. And they'll like try to keep that protected. And that protection comes by rounding that shoulder forward, I find a lot, and internally rotating. That's kind of the most protected version of the front of the shoulder. For a lot of clients.
And what that often leads to, I'm sure you've seen this, is people moving less. They begin to not move their shoulder. They begin to hold it in place. They don't want to use that arm. And that can lead to a world of worse issues down the road. That we want to keep range of motion. We want to keep, often I refer to it as passive. It's not really passive because I'm not doing it, but I want them to achieve whatever range of motion they can unweighted, you know?
Exactly. As simply as with as least amount of resistance and gravity as possible and
Exactly.
effort. Right.
Or
But
with
can
assistance from gravity even,
right. Yeah, yeah. Mhm. Yep, yep.
because some people, I mean, one of the basic exercises is, running your fingers up a wall where you're facing a
Mhm.
wall and you walk your fingers up, you walk your fingers down. It's a great exercise. Not everybody can do it to start,
My yeah. My
you
favorite
know?
there is prone on the foam roller.
Exactly.
Maybe pad it up,
Yep.
but then like gravity is going in the other direction, and you can just like walk your fingers forward, walk your fingers back. If I'm trying to get some of that scapula upward
Yep.
rotation for somebody, I start there.
Yep.
Just like crawling, just
Absolutely.
reach forward, and it's like it's a miracle, and they feel
Yep.
like they can actually get the range of motion going.
I also do it supine, lying on a foam roller or spine fitter or whatever, so their scapula's off the ground, and just
Aha.
have them take one arm. I call it scissor arm. So as one arm goes down by your side, the other arm goes up
Yes.
toward
Yep.
overhead.
Yep.
And I say, pain-free range of motion. Just go as far as you can.
Exactly.
And they
Exactly.
just scissor back and forth.
Yep.
And without a doubt, by the 10th repetition, they've got a larger range of motion.
Yep.
Things are starting to move again. And again, gravity is
Mhm.
assisting. It's pulling the arm down. It's helping. And if it hurts to be at 12 o'clock, well, guess what? You could take it to 11 o'clock or 10 o'clock. Find a range of motion and an angle that doesn't bother the shoulder joint, and just have them go through those ranges of motion. Gravity can be a big assist here instead of having them do it against gravity, which is a natural instinct, in a standing position or something where it might bother them, where the weight of their arm may be too much for them right now.
This is just so this is getting to a principle, right? This is like a principle of a lot of shoulder work, which is trying to regain range of motion in a pain-free way.
Mhm.
So finding an unweighted or a gravity assisted situation where they can comfortably explore that range of motion, because you're right, after 5 or 6 reps, and it'll get better, right? It'll just loosen up, it'll start to find a way to do it, it'll stop guarding, and you'll get some of that range of motion back. And if they can do that regularly, again in a very simple, safe environment, that's what's going to make the difference a lot of times over time.
Mhm.
And then you start to add load and you start to add resistance over time. But first, you just want to get that range of motion going and get that fluidity happening back again.
I love the word you just used, explore, because that's literally what I do when they're
Yeah.
lying on the foam roller, supine, is just explore what ranges of motion are safe,
Yeah.
what doesn't hurt, and then just have them go through that. So arm circles, start small, and then explore, make them a little bigger and a little bigger and a little bigger. And there will come a point where they're like, oh, that hurts. I say, well, don't go that far.
Exactly.
And do 4 or 5 approaching the point. Approach. Explore where those ranges of motion are. And you know what? Maybe by the 10th rep, you'll have a larger range of motion, or in the next week, you'll have a larger range of motion. Over time, that gentleness and the assistance of gravity and just getting your body to move properly again can really set people back on course a lot faster than trying to, I hate to say this, but a lot of, people who work with physical therapists, they sometimes try and do too much too quick. And that's because they don't have a lot of time. They need to get them better
Right. They got 4
faster.
sessions or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're rushing it. Whereas sometimes they need that gentle stuff first. Be gentle with it. Allow the body, allow it to explore the ranges of motion. And then we can always load them down the road. That's not hard. We
It's
can do
not a
that.
problem. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the easy part. Yeah. So I love that term, the explore. That is really what we want them to do.
And with shoulders, especially, I mean, I've done that with other parts of the body, but the shoulders, it's the exploration, I think, is also about reconnecting the coordination between
Mhm.
all the pieces, because again, it's never one player. That's the issue. It's always multiple players, and you have to get them talking to each other again,
Mhm.
and ideally talking to each other in a way that feels comfortable. I'm going to use I just have to throw this out there because this is an image I use a lot in these situations. If I'm trying to get them to just get close to the area of pain, but not to the area of pain. Like you feel like you go to a certain point, you feel the stretch, and then you feel beyond the stretch, right? Where it gets uncomfortable. There's that
Yep.
line. And I use this analogy of, I want this to be, I want you to just like kiss the area, but don't hang out there. And I often use the image of, this is the married people by honey kiss, not the newly enamored kiss, right? You're not spending any time. You're just like, hello, like, so saying hello, and then coming back in, like, okay, going into the movement, coming back out of the movement, going into the movement, coming back out of the movement. And I'll often also use speed. So sometimes not fast, but just like again, that's why you're not going to stay there. You're not going to hang out there if that's an issue. You're just going to touch it and go, right? A little touch and go, or a little kiss and you're back. And oftentimes I find that too allows them to get closer and closer to that tricky area without irritating things and without getting that fear response and that guarding.
Yeah. I think also for a lot of people, when they've been in pain for any length of time, they do have that PTSD, and they have to be told it's okay. It's
not hurting
going to be all right. You're not hurting yourself.
Yes. Yes.
But I also find by giving them a job, you're giving them a distraction.
Yes.
That they're not focused on the pain now. They're focused on whatever you tell them to be focused on. So again, scissor arms, circles, snow angels, whatever it is. I can say, okay, I want you to focus on this. And sometimes it has nothing to do with it. Like snow angels, I always say, I want your focus to be on the back of your hand on the floor. Feel that.
Really, you're just giving them something to focus on.
Put their mind somewhere else, because all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah. And you can see their range of motion is increasing, and they're not complaining. It's increasing. And sometimes I don't jinx it. I don't even want to bring their attention to it. I wait for them to say, oh, look, I can go farther than I did before. Aha. So sometimes just getting their mind off of the pain and onto what they can do instead of focused on what they can't do really can help.
I use that all the time in pain situations, because somebody has, let's say, plantar fasciitis, right? And it's just uncomfortable and it's painful. And it's like, okay, so we're going to do upper body work today, right? We're going to do core work today. We're going to just ignore your foot, at least for periods of time. Right. And it's like, and then sometimes by the end of the session, just because they're not focusing on it, like with their brain going, my foot hurts, my foot hurts, my foot hurts, my foot hurts, it feels better. So the distraction works both ways, right?
Good. Yeah. So when it comes to looking at motion, we want to talk about both the glenohumeral joint as well as the scapula to try and regain how they work together. So we talked about a couple of different exercises, but I thought let's go through some of these and just so people can jot them down. Also, I'll be showing a video of these for the YouTube as well as for our socials. But just first of all, let's talk about the scapula. I find that the foam roller is great. A lot of people ask me, well, why do you use a foam roller? Or the spine fitter I find is even better, and I'll explain why in a second. It's because their scapula is not on the ground. So it's not being fixated. It can move. It gives them that opportunity. So if they can get on the ground, I like to have them do that because it allows that. And I can have them take their arms up. I tell them zombie style, arms straight up toward the sky. Now I want you to protract. I want you to really reach as far as you can. So those scapula are now moving away from the spine. Now squeeze that foam roller. I want you to squeeze it back together. So now we're working that one range of motion, trying to get that to move better. I can do elevation. I can have them do scissor arms. So one arm's coming down as one arm's going up. So that scapula is going up and then retracting down and then going up and retracting down. So there's that more sagittal, movement, sliding, if we're doing a crawling motion, it'd be forward and back sort of thing. And then we can get into arm circles. We can get into snow angels. And all of these type of things are working the scapula, getting it to move in all the ranges of motion. And once we get into that, we're also doing the glenohumeral joint at the same time. So it's a great way to sort of introduce all of that under a gentle, pain-free, hopefully, keep in pain-free range of motion whenever possible, just to allow that movement. And if they can't get on the floor, put them up against the wall with the foam roller.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. I do. All those have been my go-tos for shoulder issues forever. Because again, I'm looking at trying to get gravity assisted or minimally resisted range of motion in all different places, and to try to get that coordination and that smoothness and those glides back, and the comfort and the confidence back in the client.
Yeah.
Love it.
And I was mentioning the spine fitter, which is that long thing that looks like a bunch of tennis balls, strapped together. Reason I like that is because of the massage that it actually gives to the trapezius, the rhomboid. So as you're moving your scapula, you're actually doing a little bit of self-care, self-massage at the same time. So it feels good. At first, people are like, ooh, this is pretty tough. And then they're like, oh, this feels good. Oh, this feels really good. And I'll have them use their feet by sliding up and down a little bit so they can get a little bit of that, superior, inferior movement. And it just starts to feel good, but they're still off the ground, so they can still do the range of motion. Their scapula can still move.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It gives them freedom of the scapula. Yeah.
Now,
Nice.
the next step often that I'll do is I will load them lying on the foam roller. So the weight of their arms will help by using bands. And I can either do that on the trap table, where I can put the bands over the bar that's above us. I find springs are just too challenging, but
they're
I
too
use
hard.
a light.
They're too hard.
A light band, a yellow or red, something light. Or even without that, just having them do some range of motion while pulling on the band in different ranges of motion, arms out like a T, maybe like an X, one arm slightly higher than the other. All of this can just begin to increase a little bit of resistance so the muscles wake up, but we're still getting a little bit of the effect of gravity. So these are just a few techniques that I've used to begin to gently introduce them to resistance, gently introduce them to movement again, and hopefully regain some of that normal range of motion and that normal movement that we're really trying to accomplish.
Nice. Sometimes I'll add like a 1 pound hand weight with some of those same movements, because it makes it a little bit differently dynamic than a band.
Yeah.
Like particularly if you're doing like one arm up, one arm down, because again, you sort of have no resistance, and then it sort of gets bigger as you go. So they've just got to deal with a little more dynamic load. But again,
I like
1
that.
pound. 1 pound. I keep it really simple. It's the same thing. It's just a different tool. The other thing too is, again, I'm going to go prone. So the supine work on the roller or the spine fitter is awesome. Prone, I haven't done prone on the spine fitter. I admit, I do prone on the roller, and I pad the roller, guys. The roller is sometimes uncomfortable for people's pubic bone or their spine or their sternum. Sorry, their sternum, not their spine, if they're prone. And I'll often have their head off of the end of the roller and support it on a towel or something, so it's not too far forward. And then I do crawls there. I just do simple crawls with the arms, with the hands on the ground. And again, that's just getting that mobility going. Gravity is really taking the load off of the shoulders, and working on that. And then in terms of, now, this is one of those steps, right? Because you really want to get that mobility going first, and then that light load, and then slowly build them into loading. And I'm going to use this loading in full range of motion. Right. So like you do with the bands or with a lightweight, like if I can get them to get some load in full range of motion, that's right. That's where I kind of want to start, because if I start with a heavy load where they can't do the full range of motion, I'm just generally going to be reinforcing whatever compensatory pattern often got them into the situation in the first place. Does that make sense?
100%. Yep.
Yeah.
I find too many people want to load too quickly because, again, ego gets involved. Well, I usually do lateral raises with 5 pounds or 50 pounds, whatever it is for the person. It's like, well, how about 1 pound? Or how about half a pound?
Right.
Or how about this light band? So we're loading it from a different angle, and you're going to feel it differently because it increases as the arm goes up. Or maybe I'll have them not step on the band. Maybe I'll load it from the side. So now they're getting more resistance at the beginning of the movement rather than at the end. Changing it up, but definitely giving them some range of motion or giving them some resistance. But like you said, working through the entire range of motion. So starting them out light.
Yep.
So if that's the key, that is the key.
Yep.
You'll get stronger over time. have no fear. Your body will figure this out. You'll get that range of motion back. And I find that, you'll be back to your old weights again within a certain period of time, but don't need to rush it. We really don't need to rush it.
And it's really like what we're trying to do is rebuild the foundation of movement in the shoulder, right? Getting the range of motion going, getting the coordination of all those members so that when they do take a heavier load and push it up overhead, for example, everything is coordinated and knows how to do that again. Because after, if something's really been funky for a while, or maybe it's always been funky for that particular person, and there's some tight spots and some things that aren't coordinated, they go to do that and the irritation is going to come in at some point, right?
Yeah. And something that just dawned on me. If you've noticed, we've talked about movement today. We have not talked about a specific muscle. We have not talked about muscle isolation.
Nope.
Because for us, getting the shoulder to move properly is the key to getting you back to be able to use the shoulder properly, hopefully with less pain, hopefully with no pain down the road.
Yep.
But those people who focus only on a single muscle, they're missing the big picture here, in my opinion.
Yep. Absolutely. No, I'm with you.
It's not about isolation. It's not about just working the bicep or only the internal or only the external rotator or only the trapezius. It's about working it all and really getting it to be in concert, working together, because that proper motion is really what we want to achieve.
And that happens with congruency, right?
Yeah.
That happens with everything working together and with coordination and with fluidity between all the different members. That's what's required for good shoulder action.
Yep.
Whether you're starting out or whether you're adding a whole bunch of load or whether you're throwing something heavy or, all those steps along the way, that coordination has to work in order for you to achieve whatever level you want to achieve. And if it's missing, you can't get there.
Yeah.
Or you can't get there safely.
Yep. And if you're only focusing on one part of it, it's like, using the band, an orchestra again. If you're only focusing on the strings, well, guess what? It's going to sound weird.
Right. You're gonna miss the whole timpani.
Exactly. We want the whole thing to be moving properly. So that's a great way to sort of think about it. And I will be videoing some of these exercises, especially the ones lying down on the foam roller or the spine fitter. That way you guys can see exactly what we're trying to accomplish and trying to get that range of motion. I'm going to play with that 1 pound weight too. I haven't done that yet. So that's why when you said that,
I like it a lot.
That's a great idea. Cause I've loaded, sometimes I'll put them from different angles in front of a wall ladder and tie tubing. So it comes from different angles. So sometimes my arm is being pulled toward the ladder. So, I'm at a 45-degree angle today, and then tomorrow I'll be at a 60-degree angle. So just so that it'll pull in different angles. So my body has to be aware of that. But I love the fact that with the 1 pound weight, because as you said, when it's directly above you, you're not feeling anything. But as that weight gets closer and closer to the ground and you're taking that weight further from the joint, you're going to feel it exponentially, and that gets that dynamic load. I love that. I'm going to be playing with that.
Go for it. Tell me how it goes. Yeah.
Excellent. So be on the lookout for that. I will be posting that in a couple of days. And thanks for joining us, guys. Our hour is up already. See, every single time we do this, it's like it goes by so quickly. So our hour is up. Again, you can always reach us at our social media pages at Moving Convos on Instagram, Moving Conversations on Facebook, or email us, movingconvos@gmail.com is the easiest way to get in touch with us. And if you have anything you want us to cover, if you have anything you want us to do a deeper dive on or anything specific, let us know. We're definitely here. We answer our emails. We will definitely cover whatever you ask us to, or if we don't want to for a specific reason, we'll say that too.
We'll let you know.
We'll let you know. Well, thanks a lot, guys. And we will see you next week.
Bye.